Great. Hi, my name is Eric Novak. I'm president of Praxis Consulting Group based in Reno. We're development finance consultants. The theme of this panel is caring for existing affordable housing, and why do we care so much about preservation? One, very simple is it takes us 2 or 3 years to work on each individual new affordable housing project, and a lot of money, and it costs a lot less and is much more expedient to preserve what we have. One of the statistics that's been cited several times is just in the GAP report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Nevada ranks last in the country in terms of the number of units available and affordable to people below 30% of AMI. We have 18 units in the 2020 GAP report for every 100 households below 30% of AMI. And the median around the country is 36 units. So we have about half the number of units. And part of that is that Nevada grew later than other states. So we got less of the federal largesse in terms of public housing and Section 8 and HUD assisted housing than other states. Those units are incredibly valuable for us to preserve. All of our affordable units are so important for us to preserve. We have a great panel today, and there's the list up there. So our panelists, first we have Betsy Fadali, who's an economist from Nevada Housing Division, and she'll be talking about our affordable housing portfolio in the state and the scale of the problem of preservation, what units are most at risk of opting out of our affordable housing programs. We have 2 speakers from other states talking that have well-defined preservation strategies and coalitions in support of housing preservation, and that's Beth Truby, who's the preservation program manager from the Colorado Housing Finance Agency Authority, CHAFA, and Rob Prasch, who's preservation director for Oregon Affordable Housing, NOAA. Finally, Frank Stafford, who's Development and Modernization Director for the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority, will be giving some practical examples of how the Housing Authority has worked to preserve its public housing. And anyway, I think this panel discussion is timely because, as Christine had noted, we have a bill draft request, or the Advisory Committee on Housing had put in a bill draft request for specifically for a preservation bill for this legislative session. And it's called, right now it has the name AB 372, and it's an early notification process for owners opting out of subsidized housing programs. And the purpose of that legislation is that it will give residents, potential buyers, local governments, and funding agencies more time to plan for preservation of individual property. So stay tuned on that. So Nevada Housing Coalition will be following that legislation and testifying in support of it and so on. So first I'd like to, we have a couple of polling questions. So if you can go to the first slide and take out your phones, and we just want to know where all the participants in this Zoom call are coming from. So if you can scan the code and fill out the survey.
So if you just hold your smartphone up to your QR code, you'll see the little pop-up there, and you click on that, it'll take you right to the survey. You don't have to sign in or anything, and go ahead and respond. And in this case, we'll see everybody's answers at once. And hit send. And if you keep your phone open, we'll actually, when the next question comes up, it'll do the same thing. Awesome. It's pretty cool. So this is just to give our panelists a good idea of who's on the summit.
So it looks like we have a good mix of participants from a number of different fields, from public agencies, housing development support like consultants and architects and so on. Going on to the next question, let's do that one. This is sort of cool. Camera. Let's do it again.
So in this one, in 1 or 2 words only, and you'll see why we limit the words. So again, just hold your phone up. And really, if you want to give us feedback at the end on what we should be pursuing, this is good practice. All right. I'll go ahead and give it 10 more seconds. So go ahead and get your 1 or 2 words in. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Awesome. And I'm going to go to the next slide. And we'll see our answers. So you can see here in the word cloud the results. And we have some people joining us, Eric, that are still in the main room.
Yeah, so Frank is in the main room and they're having trouble getting him. So you're working on that.
Yes, we're working on that. He'll be joining us.
Okay,
he may be joining
great.
us by phone.
Okay, if he does, we'll lead him through the slides. So first I want to introduce Betsy Fadali. I have a profile here somewhere. There we go. Betsy's the economist for Nevada Housing Division. She's the go-to person on anything related to our housing portfolio. And she puts out a report every year that she'll talk about. Betsy's been working for the Housing Division for the past 7 years. She has a PhD in resource economics from the University of Nevada, Reno, and has lived in Nevada for over 40 years. You're on, Betsy.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thanks so much to all of you in the Housing Coalition for organizing this summit. It's really exciting. I am going to talk just very briefly, if I can control myself, about the affordable housing inventory in Nevada, the size of it, and the size of the problem with at-risk units. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, I can do it. Oh. I work under the housing database statute. I put some of the products that I produce for it. Those are available on our Nevada Housing Division website. I gave you the links there. What we're talking about today is the affordable housing list that I keep for the state. I try to track all of our subsidized residential housing. And we can go to the next slide. I am estimating we have about 35,000 units of subsidized housing. And of course, you have to define that because you get a different number depending on what you're counting. So I am not including market rate units, for example. I took those out, so you may see some different totals in my own work that include those market rate units. I'm not including group homes or shelters. Those kinds of things are not in that count. I'm not talking about naturally occurring affordable housing. I think, unfortunately, that word affordable is quite confusing for the layman. But these are projects that are touched by government subsidies. The thing I'll say about the 35,000 is I estimate about 10,000 of those units have deeper subsidies. So the sliding scale type rent that we can use that is most effective for extremely low income households. Of course, there's also the housing choice vouchers are another resource that suits that extremely low income population, households. There's some overlap. And when you take out the overlap and you look at the 10,000 units plus the housing choice vouchers, and you look at our about 120,000, we used to, before the pandemic, have 120,000 ELI households. Who knows what the story is now? But that's where you get that number of there is 1 unit / voucher for every 5 to 6 households that could qualify in that extremely low income category. And we can go to the next slide. So I don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty details of how I came up with this estimate, unfortunately, but I've estimated about 7,600 units of our 35,000 are at least moderate risk of converting to private market units or some other form of loss. And you'll see if you scan those numbers that there's one that stands out with the very largest number, and that is the 15-year exits with the qualified contract process. That is by far our biggest vulnerability. And the units that are most of those units in that category are units set aside for 60% area media income households. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. I threw this one in here because I love the way it captures for me kind of the dynamism of this list. There's constant change. This is just the tax credit portion of the list, but that said, that's about 80% of the total 35,000. So it's most of our affordable housing. And you can see we have over the last 5 years, these are actually allocations. So some of these haven't been built yet, but we're allocating enough for around 860 new units per year over the last 5 years. We're doing allocations for about 750 renovation units being renovated. And I looked into the stats on that. About actually over half of that renovation is preservation of these deeply subsidized units. So a lot of preservation work, and this is almost all preservation. Almost all of the renovation is of units that are already in our affordable housing inventory. And then you'll see this a little bit more depressing column, the exiting units. And so those are almost all exits due to qualified contracts. And those are almost all units that are set aside for 60% area median income households. About 580 a year that on average have exited the tax credit system. That means that our net gain is around 280 units a year, or we have over the 5 years 1,400 units. That's about a 4% growth over that 5 years. And our population grew by about 7% over the 5 years. So we can go to the next slide. We are talking about collaboration. We are trying to collaborate. We have had the mission given to us to create an early warning system. We've been collecting data on individual properties that tell us something about risk, but also tell us something about priorities. maybe after Dr. T's talk, you guys are going to tell us how we're going to save all of these units. But we think that we may have to prioritize. And we have been working with Health in All Policies, the Health in All Policies program at UNR. They are going to give us some neighborhood characteristics to link to our housing list. And one of the interesting things about working with Health in All Policies is we gave them a number of projects that they could work on. And they said any one of these projects, anything that's related to housing is related to health. That's how strongly they felt about housing being linked to health. So we're continuing work on that. And with that, I'm gonna let you guys go on to the next speaker. I'm curious to hear what everybody is gonna say.
Thanks, Betsy. Next we have Beth Truby, and I find her, I'm sorry, who's the Preservation Program Manager for CHAFA, Colorado Housing Finance Authority. Beth is which focuses on, the preservation program focuses on preserving existing affordable housing statewide and leading the Colorado Housing Preservation Network. In addition to her work at CHAFA, Beth's 30+ year experience in affordable housing and community development includes time at the City of Denver, Office of Economic Development, and Habitat for Humanity of Metro Denver. So Beth, thank you for joining us.
Sorry about that. Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Eric, and glad to be here this afternoon with everybody. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Christine. Just wanted to share a little bit with you about CHAFA briefly. We're the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. We're the HFA for Colorado. We do loans to affordable housing developers, also economic development, loans to business owners. And we also do support home ownership through mortgages and homebuyer education. Next slide, please. And our investments in Colorado really are considerable. You can see in 2019, we invested over $3.3 billion in Colorado. The vast majority of that was support for home ownership, but we also have major investments, as you can see, in affordable rental and allocating tax credits and business and nonprofit lending as well. All right, let's get to the meat. Next slide. So the Colorado Housing Preservation Network, how did it form? Well, it started really in 2015, 2016. And we recognized, as you all recognize, and many have recognized, that these increasing pressures on our existing affordable housing stock were causing units to be lost. So originally, our network consisted of CHAFA and our HUD regional office, which is located in Denver, the state of Colorado, their division of housing, the city of Denver, and some nonprofits like Enterprise. They were really integral. And we've since expanded, and we have USDA in there, other local jurisdictions, a variety of housing authorities, and it's across the state. So initial efforts really centered on creating this master database, and we looked at a lot of these things that Betsy talked about, so it was great to see that. And really so that we could track the inventory of those subsidized, that's our preservation database, is those subsidized affordable units. We don't have, Betsy had public housing units in there. I think we don't have public housing units in there unless they might have received tax credits or a loan from one of the restricting agencies. But it's the subsidized affordable housing units. And then also the core group initially wanted to hire a preservation program manager, which I was lucky to be selected for that. And I really think having that point person or a linchpin to really help facilitate preservation activities and to provide that point person that people can go to about preservation. If they have preservation questions, they know where to go to. And I may not be the answer, but I know where to go and where to maybe send them if it's not myself or CHAFA. So anyway, I think that's really been critical in advancing that work. We also, then the group developed a strategic work plan with these main categories. Of course, preserving units is the top priority, but we identified action items in all these areas. But the success really has started and is maintained through this collaboration that we have through all the governmental levels, HUD, the 2 critical state agencies, local level, developers, owners, jurisdictions, everything. So I think that's really been key to our success. So we'll talk about what's going on in some of these other categories as we go through. Next slide, please. So here is our preservation database that we have. So again, it's the subsidized inventory. As Betsy said also, it really is an early warning system. So it has our HUD data, all our LIHTC data, the state lending and grants, the city and county of Denver. We also have USDA in there. And the core team originally really spent a lot of work to aggregate and standardize that data and establishing reporting protocols. As you can imagine, everybody looked at these things differently. And even if we were in the same project, they might have different addresses. So that definitely took a lot of work. Right now, we have about 1,400 properties and about 87,000 units total statewide. And there are about 250 properties with around 10,000 units that are expiring in the next 5 years. So we have a variety of information in the database. We have property and owner details, expiration dates. You can see it's color coded. LIHTC is in that light blue and it's the most prevalent. And then section 8 is the next highest number. And you can see that a lot of the projects are in the Denver metro area, but you can see that the affordable projects are spread throughout the state. So that's kind of nice to see that too. We update that information annually, and you can sort it and slice it and dice it multiple ways. You can export the data to Excel to manipulate, and we do have links to neighborhood data. So people in the network have access to the full data. We do provide the information without expiration dates. We don't want to advertise when properties are expiring, but we do have the information publicly available without some of that key information. Next slide, please. So I did want to share this too, a little bit about our PAB trends in Colorado. We had talked about that on the planning call, and I thought there might be some interest here. So CHAFA manages about half of Colorado's annual PAB allocation. And we have a competitive 9% LIHTC round every year.
Could you just explain what PAB is for folks who may
Yes, yeah, you bet. So PAB, those are private activity bonds, and every state gets an allocation of PABs that they can use for a variety of things. So you can use it for single family efforts, you can use it for multifamily, and you can use it for industrial revenue bonds. So every state, just like tax credits, get a certain allocation based on your population. So after that, then it's very, as long as it's in those uses, we have been using it for multifamily, but states and entities can use it different ways. And so, for example, Denver gets their own allocation and they can use it how they want. But CHAFA, as I said, gets about 50% of that PAB allocation. Now, PABs are always paired with 4% federal tax credits. So people may be familiar with the 4% program. So 4% tax credits aren't limited like the 9% are, but the PABs are. So once the PAB runs out, then your 4% run out. So many states have plenty of PAB allocation, but a few states, and Colorado is one of them, are really bumping up against their PAB allocation. And that's, you can see here, the blue and green lines, those are sort of what's available and what we're using. And you can see, 2016, 2017, we had a decent amount that we weren't using at all. But you can see starting in 2020 and going forward, we're going to be very close to using up what we have available every year. And in our 9% competitive LIHTC round, only 6% of the money in that round in 2019 went to preservation. So the 9% are not often available as funding for preservation. They don't compete too well. But we do have a state affordable housing tax credit that we pair with those 4% federal tax credits. 22% in that competitive round went to preservation. And then the remainder of our PAB allocation that you compare with the 4%, we allocate that in a non-competitive way. So 42% of that went to preservation. So it's really critical resource for preservation in Colorado. And you can see it's being utilized so heavily that it's a concern and it's an issue. So it's very much in demand. And I just want to mention the qualified contracts have come up. We've heard Betsy mention those, or Eric, or whoever. But we haven't allowed that for years with our 9%. You have to waive that. And we also eliminated that ability for 4% this year. So even if you're getting non-competitive 4% tax credits, you still have to waive your ability to have a qualified contract. So we've only had one qualified contract executed successfully in all the time that I'm familiar with. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share briefly some of our partnerships. We work, for example, with Energy Outreach Colorado, and we use that database to target energy efficiency programs and grants that they have to some of these older LIHTC properties. So that was a great use of that. We've had a variety of specialized trainings and learning opportunities. We worked with Enterprise. They're holding a rural preservation academy to try and build capacity in those rural areas to do preservation deals. We had an intensive mod rehab workshop, which is a special kind of Section 8, to try and get those properties to re-syndicate and facilitate their rehab. Somebody mentioned the law that is going to be brought up in Nevada this year about notice for if early notification if a property is going to be leaving the subsidized housing family. So Denver has that preservation ordinance in place. And when there's a sale of an income restricted property, the owners have to provide the city or their designee with the right of first refusal. So the city can come in and purchase that out. So we work with them closely on outreach for that and on trying to preserve some of those properties that they hear about that are coming up for sale. And Boulder, I have to say, I didn't realize when I first started the preservation work that we were going to be so into mobile home park work, but we really have come into that. And Boulder has a really robust mobile home park preservation policy. They have special zoning for them and ordinances encouraging the preservation. And this is a picture of Ponderosa Mobile Home Park, which the city actually purchased in 2017. And we work with them on replacement designs to be developed for those units that will fit in the existing footprint of the mobile home park. And they're going to be using modular practices for the construction of those units and working with the local habitat in that area. So the residents will be able to stay in their existing mobile homes or purchase a new home if they would like. Next slide, please. And that leads into single family, because we do work on some single family homeownership preservation. A lot have dealt with working with community land trusts. So we have a revolving loan fund to land trusts that they use for the ACK rehab of single family homes, especially in gentrifying areas. So they're preserving that affordable homeownership permanently. We also have recently done a loan that I think has a lot of potential with other housing authorities, where we approved an $8.5 million loan for another land trust to purchase a scattered site portfolio from a housing authority in Fort Collins, which is a college town. There's not a lot of affordable housing there. So they're going to be rehabbing and turning into home ownership all those units. And we're also piloting a first look program where you saw how we had a strong home ownership program. Well, if we're taking homes back in foreclosures, that we're offering them to nonprofits first. And often we can provide a little bit of a discount. And the first one was sold to a land trust. So that one's become permanently affordable instead of going back to HUD or just selling it on the open market. Next slide, please. So since 2016, when we really started in earnest, we preserved about 16,000 units. As I mentioned, we really have been getting into this mobile home park preservation sphere, and we, CHAFA, have provided loans, but we're really focused on the ROC model, the resident-owned community model, where residents of mobile home parks purchase the park and manage it themselves. So we have provided some lending for that. And a lot of our mountain communities and rural areas have been really interested in that. That's 4% of the housing stock in Colorado. It's about 95,000 units. So that's larger than the subsidized inventory. We have been able to develop some new resources. We again use the database for capital magnet fund application that a Colorado CDFI impact development fund they did in 2019. And that database information really helped them make the case for preservation financing. So they were able to receive the capital magnet fund award of $5 million specifically for preservation financing. Betsy brought up the NOAA properties. We are working on developing a database similar to our preservation database, so we can identify properties and portfolios that we might want to target. And again, the initial analysis of some small scale NOAA properties, so 49 units and under, there's around 300,000 units in the Denver metro area alone. So there are definitely some preservation opportunities there, and we want to move to maybe take advantage of that a little bit more. And then trying to develop this, we're right in the middle now, trying to develop a specific preservation fund to get some new capital for preservation, especially some short-term bridge financing, so that we compete, so that our nonprofits and mission-driven organizations can compete on the market to secure some of these properties. Last slide, next slide. And just ending on this great property, Colburn Hotel was an 88-unit SRO. For homeless, formerly homeless, in a very hot area of Denver. It definitely was going to go to market, but Gorman and Company acquired the property. The partners, the housing preservation partners, collaborated on the financing, and it's successfully undergoing that RAD transition right now. So you can see we've got a lot going on, and the work is really evolving all the time. So looking forward to any questions and discussions and the next presentations. Thanks.
Thanks, Beth. Please ask questions in the chat, and we'll bring those up at the end of the presentation. NOAA, for folks who don't know, that is naturally occurring affordable housing. And so as I see acronyms, I'll try and get them explained. Next, we have Rob Prasch, who is the Preservation Director for the Network of Affordable Housing. NOAA is an Oregon nonprofit financial institution offering a broad range of products and services to affordable housing developers. As Preservation Director, Rob facilitates the Oregon Housing Preservation Project, whose partners include federal, state, and local housing agencies, philanthropies, and preservation-focused developers. I'll let Rob go on now. We're so excited, by the way, to have this. We've been planning this presentation before the pandemic, and so it's so great to be able to get these folks on before us, and we would like to be emulating some of these things in Nevada. So thank you. So Rob.
Great, thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. You're going to hear a little bit more of the same thing that you just heard from Betsy and Beth. I think there are a lot of people in a lot of states that have been doing preservation for quite some time, and we all borrow from each other's best practices. So just a little bit about NOAA. We are a statewide CDFI. We have about $270 million in lending capital that we lend out through a variety of programs. We have an acquisition fund, something that Beth just mentioned, that kind of allows preservation-focused developers to compete with larger developers and move in quickly and get a property under control. And have the time that they need to assemble their permanent financing. So next slide, please. We'll just jump right into the preservation project. It was formed in 2007 by a group of housing experts that we were looking at a wave of Section 8 contract opt-outs coming. And so there was a circling of the wagons. We had key partners from all part of the affordable housing industry. The Housing Alliance, Oregon Housing Alliance, was really a key in bringing this coalition together. We worked with our HFA, Oregon Housing and Community Services, City of Portland, HUD and RD. And philanthropy played a critical role in not only getting this initiative started, but also supporting it even through today. And the first money and the first big push came from our state's largest charitable foundation, Myra Memorial Trust. And they have had an affordable housing initiative since 2006 and have invested tens of millions of dollars in affordable housing. But they really, they were around the table when we formed a steering committee and helped develop all the strategies that we deployed to preserve our housing. They also brought 2 other Oregon-based foundations into the mix. And it was those 3 Oregon foundations working closely together and collaborating that got the attention of the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, that they were launching a national preservation initiative with like $125 million total. And we were successful. We ended up getting $5 million, $1 million in grant and $4 million in program-related investment that helped seed our Oregon Affordable Housing Acquisition Fund. So next slide, please. Those 5 key strategies, things that you've already heard about today from the others, that database of your assisted multifamily rental housing is key. You really can't start until you know what you have. And it was surprising how much we didn't know when we started. We had a couple lists from our state HFA and from the HUD office, but as we looked deeper and deeper, we found more and more units. So we have a good inventory that's been assembled. It's available at preserveoregonhousing.org. That's our preservation website. Like others around the country, we knew immediately that we would need a short-term acquisition fund. So we formed that with the help of the foundations. And to date, it's worked very well. We've done 36 total loans since launching it in 2008, right after the bubble burst. We came right out of the gate and did 8 or 10 loans in the first 2 years. But so far, almost 1,900 units preserved, and those are just temporary transactions. Those are designed for the preservation-focused buyer to get a hold of the property, stabilize it, and have a year or 2 or 3 that it takes to get tax credits and other sources lined up to do a full recapitalization. We were working with a lot of preservation-focused developers who were running into barriers and roadblocks. So we formed interagency working groups with our state and federal housing agencies and really removed some of those problems, and everybody got on the same page, and we had some impressive results over a few years period. Initially we had a pot of small grants that we could put into properties to green up their rehab scopes of work to get green and sustainable building practices and particularly energy efficiency into these older buildings that were being renovated. That was pretty impactful. And then I think just building support in the legislature for continuing investments in preservation was critical to our support. And that's where the coalition building really comes into play. Next slide, please. And I think this summarizes all of the funding sources that have gone into our collaborative preservation initiative, both the preservation project and the acquisition fund. So you'll see that we have public funders, we have private foundations, and participating commercial banks. That first column shows grant funds that have supported operations and included some pass-through funds to nonprofits doing some work in this area. But also the next column, that risk-tolerant capital that comes from public funders and from the foundations is really what allows us to leverage commercial bank funds, so that we were able to create a fund with about $35 million in capital that allowed us to put these loans out quickly. We can do them generally in 90 days to 120 days and allow those preservation-focused developers to compete. Next slide, please. This is our homepage on our preservation website, and I just put it up because I wanted to call your attention to the sidebar. Doug Stamm, the former CEO of Mara Memorial Trust, he was a very active participant. These are his words about why preservation is so important. He was he testified to the Housing Committee and the legislature, and a number of times I was with Doug when we did meetings at the Capitol with key legislators. You can't replace that kind of level of support. Next slide, please. And of course, our state HFA has been a partner in the preservation project right from the beginning. And we help formulate policies that promote preservation and put a lot of pressure on them. It's one of the benefits of being outside of the agency, because we can criticize and we can also make suggestions and we can support them. And I would say it's been very successful. They continue to maintain a set aside for preservation projects in their annual 9% LIHTC NOFA. This year, past year, it was 25%, but it's been as high as 50% in some years. They offer gap funds for preservation bond transactions. And in Oregon, these are often portfolios of scattered site, small rural projects that are very difficult to finance on their own. But when you combine them and get up to scale, then suddenly you can use a bond deal to do those. Here in Oregon, we also have, since 2007, highlighted or prioritized preservation of manufactured housing communities. So Oregon Housing has an annual NOFA for preserving manufactured home parks. And just last year, under the various NOFAs that Oregon Housing put out, they were able to preserve 25 total projects and over 1,100 units. Next slide. And this slide I just throw up to give you an idea of the impact of the preservation initiative across the state. All across the state, every area of the state has tiny little projects, big projects. We've preserved over 300 properties since 2006, almost 15,000 total units, 11,000 with rental assistance. It's been very impactful, especially it's useful when you go and you meet with legislators that wouldn't necessarily be supportive, but you show them what's at risk in their legislative district, and you show them where the funds that the legislature has approved have helped preserve properties in their districts, and suddenly they see how important it is, and they get behind it. So, next slide. And to that point, here is a summary of the funding that our legislature has provided over the last 12 years. Over $110 million that make these preservation transactions work. General fund and lottery-backed bonds create a source of gap funding resources that could then get paired with bonds and 9% credits to make those deals work. We've also had great success in getting preservation-related legislative passed over the 5 years, and we have a couple lined up for the upcoming session. Next slide. Of course, I think I missed this morning's session, but there, of course, are always challenges and opportunities. In Oregon, we face a growing universe of affordable housing properties that are coming to the end of their restricted use periods. Tax credit projects are up against their 30 years, all types of properties, and we are carefully monitoring those and making sure we can try to do our best to preserve them. The rural development maturing mortgage problem, we need to preserve those properties when they come to the end of those mortgages, or we'll lose them permanently, and there's no protections for the residents. Of course, there's always need for better data and risk analysis, and a permanent source of preservation funding, so that we don't have to go back to the legislature year in and year out trying to raise capital for these deals. There's a large need for training and capacity for rural organizations, especially, and enterprises bringing their preservation academy to the Northwest next year. And then lastly, just the new approaches needed to work with rural development and HUD under their new centralized multifamily operations. We've had them at the table as great partners, and we just have to figure out how to work with them now that they're no longer here, present in our state. Next slide. And I'll just finish with two examples at opposite ends. This an historic building in downtown Portland was converted to Section 8 property, Section 8 housing in 1980. You know, after 35 years or so, it was ready for a full upgrade, which it got 2 years ago. It serves seniors and disabled population. And next slide. And at the opposite end of that, Merrill Apartments in Merrill, Oregon, which is right on the California border in Southern Oregon, rural development, 12 total units. This property happens to be the only apartment building in that little town, and it was almost lost to prepayment. And that would have been just a tragedy for that small community. So I'll end there and we'll take questions later.
Thanks, Rob. Yes, we also are trying to figure out who our USDA contacts are now on projects with the reorganization. Our final speaker is Frank Stafford, who's Director of Development and Modernization at the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. Frank has been with Sunra for 27 years, where he's held various positions, including his current leadership role. He's overseen successful efforts for the Housing Authority to preserve affordable housing units for Nevadans extremely low and for Nevada's extremely low income population. And we've worked with Sunra for 15 plus years on a lot of their RAD and public housing preservation projects. And I think it's just an incredible story, since those units serving people below 30% of AMI with rental assistance are so incredibly valuable. So Frank, you're on.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Eric mentioned, I've been with the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority, or for the Housing Authority, for 27 years now, with the first 16 being the City of Las Vegas Housing Authority. And we can move on to the next slide, please. And as you can see, back in 2010, we converted the 3 housing authorities here in Southern Nevada, which was Las Vegas, Clark County, and a year later, North Las Vegas, to create the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. We have roughly 3,000 public housing units now, 800 assisted housing, and 229 mobile home pads. Our Section 8 department is huge, with over 11,000 vouchers. Next slide, please. And just to kind of give you, I guess, a lead in to our preservation of housing, low-income housing in the area. A portfolio was conducted back in 2014 with the Housing Authority, and we worked along with Eric and Scott over at EJP, and some of the items we looked at was doing various interviews and site visits. They looked at operating expenses, the capital needs that we needed, which were very high, condition of neighborhoods and the demographics. And also, that was the time that we really got involved into the RAD program, the Rental Assistance Demonstration. Next slide, please, sir. Different financing tools that we looked at was LIHTC. We looked at how we're going to get the jobs done, design, bid, build. We've had projects that we've done with development partners. We did some that we've kind of self-developed and used the various fundings, as I mentioned, LIHTC, but also home funds, housing trusts, Federal Home Loan Bank funds. Next slide, please. And during that assessment, there was a prioritized that was set up looking at our entire portfolio. And it was determined from that which would be the best properties to select to start our preservation. So as I mentioned, at that time, we had just merged, and we had quite a few units that were really in severe need of capital improvements. And of course, the funding sources that we were getting from HUD would have made that process take probably, 25, 30, 40 years or more. So this was the perfect timing when the RAD project came along, and we were able to, we looked at trying to do at least 9% tax credit property for a year, but that didn't mean that we weren't going to look at other ways to continue to preserve housing. So you can look at the slide and kind of see the different methodologies that we use to try to get the funding to secure those. Next slide, please. And I'll just kind of highlight, just like I said, this started back in around 2014. And as you can see, we did 8 properties, and actually 2 of those are currently still under development, which is going to total about 809 units. And you can see the price tag on that. Next slide, Eric. So I'll just kind of highlight the properties that we've completed or are working on during this process. The first one was the Lansman Gardens property, which is out in Henderson, Nevada. It was a 100-unit development, family, built in 71. This was kind of unique because it was the first FHA that was approved under our RAD program. And the Housing Authority self-developed that particular property with RAD and using 4% tax credits. The property construction cost is about $14 million, and it looks very, very good today. Next slide, please. And here you can kind of see a before and after. The property had a lot of issues with, water damages on the buildings. So we basically stripped it down to the stud, including removing the roofs, and did a complete rehab on it. So the property, like I said, came out very, very nice, as you can see on the right screen. Next slide. And that's some of the interior shots of Lansman Gardens. Next slide, please. And from Lansman, our second property was Vera Johnson B, which is a 112-unit family development. We have some home units in there with funds that we received from the city of Las Vegas. That property had been built in 1984, so it was in desperate need of having a rehab work on that one. We did that one with a development partner, so it wasn't just self-developed with the Housing Authority. It was 9% tax credits. As I mentioned, we also got home funds and used our capital fund from public housing with a total cost of about $9.8 million. That reopened in 2016. In the next slide, you'll see some before and afters of it. You drive through there now and it just looks like a totally different property. The residents are really, really, really pleased. Okay, next slide. The Beager Estates was a property that was located out in unincorporated Clark County. That was built in 1985, and we did the rehab starting back in 2016. 119 family units. It was self-developed under RAD with 9% tax credits and public housing capital fund with a total cost of $18 million. Total development cost of $18 million, but hard cost for construction, $10 million. Next slide, please. And once again, we have some before and after, and you can see the buildings really, really came out nice, and they don't look like public housing at all. It's just, and that's kind of what the big point of this preservation has been as well. It's not only, creating decent, safe housing, but we also want to get the public housing look away that's just any other home in the community. Next slide, please. Our Vera Johnson A, which is almost identical to the Vera Johnson B development. This one we did, it was a LIHTC program. It was not RAD. It was 76-unit family development. And these units are still part of our public housing portfolio. It was substantial rehab, self-developed with the Housing Authority. And although, like I said, the projects are almost identical, you can see that we did a few creative differences on these 2 properties. We had a construction cost on this one about $7.3 million, and we completed the work in 2018. And the next slide will show you some before and afters on that one. Actually, it looks like we just got after, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Next slide, please. Our Rose Gardens was a property that we built in 1975. Now, with this particular one, we demolished the old property, which is across the street from the new one. So Rose Gardens, we refer to as new Rose Gardens, as new construction. We initially started this project up on a Choice Neighborhood Initiative, but the project was actually built through the RAD process with a developer partner, and we used 4% tax credits, home funds, AHP, and gap funds as well on that. The hard construction cost about $18 million. And what was unique about it, and you can go to the next slide, Eric. Or, okay, I'm sorry, back up. Okay, so what was unique about this particular property was the old Rose Gardens was a 3-story building, and it was in very, very bad shape. So we got approval from HUD to demolish that building. But in the meantime, the residents stayed in the old building. And out of the 120 that were there, I think we transferred 109 to the new building. So they were able to observe the construction of their new building from start to finish. And once that was completed, we demolished the old buildings that they occupied. So next slide, please. Espinosa Terrace is a property that we have out in Henderson, Nevada. Again, this was a preservation property. It's 100 units total on that site, was built in 1973. That was self-developed, and we used 9% tax credits, as well as City of Henderson and Clark County Home Funds and AHP funds. The total hard cost on this property was $13.8 million, and we just wrapped that one up January of this year. Next slide, please. We are currently doing a preservation at our Archie Grant Apartments, which is 125 unit senior development. Part of this property was done back in 2007, where we rehabbed half of it. And now we went back and did the northern half of the property, as well as went back to the southern portion to make sure that anything that needed to be upgraded was done on that one. It's a RAD 9% tax credit project, self-developed with the Housing Authority, and we had home funds that were attached to that one with the construction cost of $13.6 million. And the slides that are up are the after construction pictures from the north side of the property. Next slide, please. And our Wardell Street townhouses is a property that we started construction in January of this year. This photo was taken just a couple of days ago. We're getting ready to open up the first 3 buildings, which will total 18 units here in about another 2 weeks or so. Next slide, please. This property is a 57 unit family development. It's going to be a combination of public housing with 20 public housing units and 37 project-based voucher units on the site. So it's new construction. It was self-developed with 9% tax credits. And it was on one of our old Ernie Cragen projects that we demolished back in about 2008, 2009. So this was a long time coming, trying to build something on that vacant land to actually increase public and affordable housing in the Las Vegas area. We anticipate completing construction on this property by the end of this year, and we should have all 57 units online and occupied in early January. Next slide, please. Some of the lessons learned, I mean, so we've been at this for a little while. So we found out you got to be flexible in the implementation and respond to opportunities as they arise. You know, this is really, really unique with us because, you know, being on the HUD, we have a lot of regulation that we have to deal with And the timelines on these projects are really, really tight, where typically you're looking at 1 year to prepare and 1 year to construct. So you have to be really flexible on how we move. Under the rehab, of course, anybody that's did rehab work, you know that once you start to open walls up, no matter what your as-built show or what type of design you got, there's always going to be surprises that you have to deal with. Top that in with the prevailing wages that we have to use under HUD. So the cost can go up. So we have to be really, you know, basically, I mean, you have to really try to be layers of focus on what you're trying to do to make sure that you can get the best bang for your buck. Of course, HUD policies we have to deal with, especially with the RADs. You know, we have to do the relocation piece of that, and that can be an issue because once you any resident wants to return to those units have the right to return. So if you move them off, you got to make sure that you can get them back in a year, or there's penalties that you have to deal with on that. Institutional challenges for the housing authority. You know, in our particular case, with this being new, you know, you had employees and not employees, even on executive staff, that have been doing things the same way for such a long period of time. So, you know, even though you're still providing public housing, there's going to be some changes on how you operate under the LIHTC with affordable and with public housing. But fortunately, you know, with us, we've been able to work through all of that. And now, you know, over the years, since we've been doing it for a while, and staff changes, that's getting a lot better. And it's always key to look at development partners who can help increase your capacity and spread goodwill throughout the community, and continue to promote preservation message. Next.
That's it. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, we have a little bit of time for questions. We have about 7-8 minutes left. I had a question for both Rob and for Beth of what are the biggest preservation challenges you're seeing right now? What keeps you awake at night? And either of you, if you want to take a crack at that.
I mean, sure, I'll go. I mean, I think the need for resources is one of the biggest ones. And as we've mentioned, everybody knows, the tax credits are really starting to come through starting in 2021. So we're going to just have just a much larger need for resources. And that's why we're hoping to get the preservation fund going and attract some new resources. But I think also a lot of times people aren't, I think Frank mentioned it on the last slide about getting that message out about preservation, because I think there's a lot of times a bias to new construction and everybody wants new units. So I do think that's an issue. And then this competition with the market. I mean, Colorado, I'm sure a lot of your communities are like this. It's very hot in a lot of markets. So it's very difficult to compete on the open market with just market rate buyers.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Beth. We see the similar situation here. And in 2017, we passed a new preservation ordinance that our statute that allows for a right of first refusal for preservation-focused buyers. And what that's done is it's created expectation that there will be resources available for preservation-focused developers to buy these properties and match those offers when they're made from third-party market rate buyers. And the money isn't there right now. That's one of the challenges that we're facing, is to try to come up with a permanent funding source so that we can prioritize those and preserve as many of them as we can. The subsidized properties are just, there's no problem preserving those. Everybody understands if the state invests $10 million to preserve a property, they're going to get back $100 million in rental assistance over the next 20 or 30 years. So that's easy to sell. It's the other types of properties that need to be preserved that are the biggest challenge.
We had a question which was from someone in the audience for Rob. How does Oregon calculate jobs created from preservation investments? I mean, how do you make the case for
Yeah.
economic development.
So the first challenge is to get the construction costs from the developers. So we track that. And then a few years ago, the state used the M-Plan economic development model that came out of the University of Minnesota. That, and I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but it's something like 1.7 jobs for every $100,000 invested, something like that. I really don't remember, but you could look it up. M-Plan, M-I-M-P-L-A-N.
Mhm.
So that's the model that we've used.
Great. We had another question, Beth, was for what funding sources are used for Chaffa's preservation fund?
Yeah, and that's something that's it's still under development right now, so we don't have it available, so I'm working on it. But, so we don't have commitments and everything, but what I'm hoping, what it's sort of looking like is Chaffa is gonna put in an initial commitment from some of our unrestricted funds. So we'll start that there, and we had originally had some very soft commitments from the state of Colorado and the city of Denver also, who both have had, you know, in the last couple of years, they both had a lot of dedicated sources for housing be implemented and passed through the legislature and passed through the city council. And so they were starting to finally get some decent funding for affordable housing. And then of course, COVID hit, and they were gonna commit some to the preservation fund. And of course, COVID hit. So that, as we all know, has impacted everybody's governmental budgets. So I think they both still will commit something, but it may be on a longer time frame than we had initially hoped. So commitment from Chaffa, likely a commitment from the state and the city of Denver, but also some bank funding. And we do have in Colorado some foundations that in the past, you know, 10 years ago, a lot of these foundations never, at least in Colorado, really weren't in housing. But a lot of them are realizing that housing has such an impact on their mission that they have to do something with housing. So we've got, you know, a very strong health foundation, the Colorado Health Foundation, that has been really getting into housing a lot. So I'm hoping some of these foundations, I mean, I'm not committing them to anything, but some of these foundations who are recognizing that they've got to do something with housing. So I'm hoping we're going to get some foundation funding in there too.
That's great. And so we heard some really important ingredients, a preservation database, so an early warning system sort of for that. And it sounds like both states have funds of some sort to allow good nonprofit stewards or good stewards of affordable housing maybe to jump in to buy something. Maybe it's a timing issue, or it's just having access to quick capital to buy properties to take them out of the market. Is that, what other ingredients do you think are important to a successful preservation strategy? That
well, I would jump in and just say that for us, it's been having that coalition, that collaborative approach. That because, you know, as an individual or even as one organization, you can't walk into the Capitol and influence decisions. But if you have a affordable housing coalition like we have in Oregon, the Oregon Housing Alliance, over the years they've gained greater power and greater influence in the Capitol, and they have paid lobbyists that can actually, you know, make a big difference. And you know, it's well invested time and money.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I mean, I agree completely. It's the collaboration is really critical, and just amongst all the different levels and all the different types of housing stakeholders. I mean, that really has been such a benefit. I do have to say just one other quick thing. The TA, somebody brought this up, sort of the TA and capacity building. We're trying to work on that a little bit. The state of Colorado has often done provided some TA and capacity building and grants at early stages, but this is new for CHAFA, and CHAFA is starting to move into that as well. We're going to be paying for some TA and capacity building, and it won't be just for preservation, but that will be for preservation in some of these areas in the state, most of the state, where it's really hard to do any kind of deal, much less a preservation deal.
Well, so Christine, do we have some housekeeping at the end of the panel? Are there some surveys to fill out, or I'm not sure what the, as we close this, but I want to thank all the panelists for your time. This is really inspiring as we think about how Nevada can start building its coalition for preservation. And Christine, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, Eric. So you can either respond in the chat and just put your answers, but remember, as I was saying earlier, we want to make sure that your thoughts are captured. So you can also utilize here, and it'll capture it anonymously. You know, Eric kind of summed up some of the things that we heard from other states. We hear the good work of the housing division and where they're moving. And we hear also from the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. So what would we like to learn more about? We could probably spend half a day talking about preservation. So if you can submit your answers, and feel free to just drop them in the chat, or you can use the polling tool. And if you open it up, just stick your phone right on it and you can click in, and it's very easy. And likely this will also help inform for our policy strategies going forward in any workshops. And additionally, drop in the chat or go ahead and fill it out if there are other tools or solutions that we should be considering that maybe you know about and we didn't hear about this morning. So that's it. And finally, if you have your chat open, go ahead and rate the session. And that's all, Eric.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone again. And I think we will definitely be in contact with you, Rob and Beth, on your strategies in Colorado and Oregon. And stay tuned for Nevada Housing Coalition's information about the upcoming legislative session. We have a number of bill draft requests that are either in or that we're marketing, shopping around right now. And yes, so we're so excited to see the coalition